Well, good afternoon. So we're going to start over because somebody is just going to town on some leaves out there. The blower's been going nonstop for hours. It must be gas powered, am I right? So long story short, I've been working with St. John of the Cross and his Obscure Night of the Soul. And I went from that, which is just a piece. It's what St. John calls the aridity of the soul. This idea that you get no joy in life whatsoever. What is your disconnection from your trust, from your faith, from your hope, from your passions, from meaning, from value? What do you do when you have a disconnection from what you value, a disconnection from who you are, who you know, what you value? So St. John of the Cross very specifically was discussing his disconnection from divinity, from the benefits that he sees, or you may have seen in contemplation, contemplating God and your true nature. And when you no longer feel that. In fact, it's funny because when we talk about St. John of the Cross and the Carmelites, it's interesting to find out that in reading Mother Teresa's writing, she suffered from this very similar aridity for many, many years. This disconnect from what we consider our passion. And what's funny is I did a little experiment. I've mentioned Mortimer Alder before. He wrote a great book on how to read. As I said, I've been spending very specifically the last year or two, learning how to learn, how to read, how to learn, how to actually take from these books, from these seminars, from these works, the knowledge, the understanding, the experience, the perspective, and apply it to my own understanding, to my own experience, to my own life. So being dyslexic, I had a hard time just reading, period. And up until the last couple of years, I could read with great difficulty, but none of that would be retained. Fast forward a few years, and I was able to read, but to be able to take a piece from this and apply it to that, arguably, long story short, going from Mortimer Alder's How to Read, analytical reading, and how to develop what Northrop Frye called archetypal criticism. So going from being able to read and understand what the story in front of you is and about and the lessons meant to convey, and going one step deeper and having the ability to see the resonance that transcends time and space. But I know that sounds silly. Just being able to see the archetypes, like the hero's journey or the wounded healer. Sounds weird, but it's just being able to see yourself or your story in others, or to see another story, how it resonates for someone else. What do I mean by that? Okay, I mentioned St. John of the Cross, which is this dark night of the soul, which relates to trauma. I'm actually trying to find the archetypal criticism of all trauma theory, right, to bring this together. Well, part of that is understanding what trauma is. What is this malaise that Carl Jung wrote about 100 years? What is this apathy that we suffer from that Nietzsche wrote about? What is this aridity of the soil, this disconnect from meaning and value that St. John and Theresia of Avila wrote about in antiquity, or even many Greeks and Indian philosophers have written about? But let's just stick to a little bit more modern, right? Because we're talking about psychology, and we don't want to get bogged down by historical context and what have you. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Sure, Book of Job, right? There's a great example. Very similar to St. John of the Cross, but again, very old. So let's come forward a little bit. And I found a book, as I said, with an experiment of Mortimer Alder's how to pick a book cold. So I was doing laundry, and I just so happened to come across a book that there's a little donation little thing, you know, little lending library, as it were. And so it just, this one book, it put me off at first because it's by William Styron. Never heard of this guy before. I don't read a lot of fiction. He pretty much exclusively wrote fiction. The book is called Darkness Visible, and underneath it says A Memoir of Madness. But once I looked, I found out, well, he was classifying his depression as madness. So at first I was going to be like, oh, nope, not for me. But I decided, you know what? I'm going to go for it. But what's absolutely astonishing is there is no end of connection. Because he even mentions something that I've talked about probably a while ago now. William James, and more specifically William James and his varieties of religious experience. And in it, he mentions what I've talked about, this important understanding that William James came to, the fact that you have some people that just find their passion and value in life and they have no problems. Then there's some people that have to come to some sort of understanding or an enlightenment or an awakening, these second-born people. But then there are people like myself and others, like Mother Teresa. I'm not saying I'm like her in any other way except for a lack of passion, of joy, of connection, a daemon of distress, right? So this specter that hovers above us always, right? Albert Camus, right? Understanding that life is absurd. It is suffering. And in that, we must still find our meaning. Right? So what did I find? This book, Darkness Visible, A Memoir of Madness. Well, as I said, I took to it as an experiment in analytical reading, archetypal criticism, and then, of course, just research for what I'm working on. So the book opens up, as I said, #1 national bestseller. I read this book on November 6th and 7th, so that means in the last 2 days I've read 3 books. I listened to Albert Camus' The Fall, because again this ties to this same idea, this darkness visible. Well, and I actually went through The Obscure Night of the Soul again, as well as a big chunk of Liber Novus, Carl Jung's book. So this week alone, I mean, you know, you can read a ton of books, even if you're dyslexic. Today, the experiment was, how much can I learn and retain reading, since I've spent so much time listening, audiobooks and stuff. So the first page in this is just listed Darkness Visible, a markdown that I read it November 6th/7th. I picked it up yesterday, and I went through the last couple of chapters just to get an idea if it would be something for me to read. And I decided yes. So I started over right from the start this morning. And so the note I made was archetypal criticism. I had no idea that's what I was doing, because as I mentioned, I lucked out. I went to a high school that the English teacher accepted me as her student, mainly because I think my passion, obviously, but I was a bit weird, right? So I was this dyslexic kid who had incredible levels of intellect in some areas, but was just absolutely pathetic in other areas. So I don't know why she took me on. I've said this before. I think she accepted me as a student because I was reading Thus Spake Zarathustra, and that's what she corrected me on, believe it or not, because the Penguin edition I had said spoke, but she said, no, it's Thus Spake Zarathustra. And what I didn't realize is, unlike most students who would never even... Well, I didn't understand that Zarathustra is one of the scariest books, period, but philosophy especially. It's certainly not as hard to read as, say, Finnegan's Wake. I would say it's comparable to Ulysses. You can read it, you can say you've read it, but to garner an understanding, or to get this analytical understanding, a deep, deep personal connection with the work, is rare. So I don't know if it was a connection, the fact that I was in love with it, but I digress. The reason why I mention it is I lucked out, because not only was this teacher a PhD in high school, which was weird, obviously, but I needed the extra help, being having been French immersion for so long. I needed the help in English, because we didn't get a lot of English courses, believe it or not, in French immersion. So I needed someone who was good. I was pretty good with grammar, because for some reason I can just hear what's right. I don't know anything about, or especially then, adverbs, adjectives, all that. I knew nothing of that. But for some lucky reason, because of my aptitude in verbal, I was able to understand what's correct and incorrect when it came to grammar, because I could just hear it, right? And that's why I mentioned my American Lit teacher said I wrote with a very specific voice, mainly because that's the only way I knew how to read, right? But what I found out is this teacher got her PhD under Northrop Frye, very famous Canadian, who actually became famous because he opened up the works of William Blake. He made people realize that it was steeped in Bible and Milton's Paradise Lost in its allegory and metaphor. And that opened up his poetry, because before that, William Blake was considered maybe gibberish, maybe too dense to understand, but that's neither here nor there. But this PhD professor, I will argue, because she had taught in colleges, and for some reason she came to high schools because she wanted, I guess, that whole cliche of young minds. But, oh, please, I hope when I can get this together that this some of these ladies and gentlemen that helped me can see what their good works have done. Because this lovely lady encouraged my love of things like Nietzsche and Kipling, and this really obscure stuff that most of these students had no interest in, and just this understanding that arguably went beyond any of the education I was given. I was an autodidact at this point, because there was no philosophy classes, and I had gotten very little English instruction up to this point, because I had gone grade 9, 10, and then 10 again, essentially, which for French immersion is all French except for math and English. Believe it or not, it's funny, because even our history and all that stuff is in French. I actually found my high school transcripts recently. That's what I realized. For the first 3 years of high school, I had pretty much nothing but French. But what I ended up having to do is they didn't test me for a learning disability. They just assumed I was a problem child. So I had to redo grade 10, essentially. But what ended up happening there is I went from grade 10 advanced to grade 10, essentially grade 10 general, but it ended up being a mix of grade 10 and 11, because, I mean, I wasn't a general student. I was just not challenged enough and severely dyslexic, as it were, right? Developmentally challenged as well. There's a whole discussion of whether learning disabilities are traumas from a young age, or developmental disability, or it could be something physical, right? Eyesight, hearing, stuff like that. But these teachers really did help me, because this teacher with the PhD actually created her own course. Sure, she did teach, but she taught way more than we were ever expected. I think I mentioned this. When I applied to university, they added more than 10 points. If I'm not mistaken, it was 11 points to my marks, because I went to this particular high school. And I know why, because we studied something called The Educated Imagination by Northrop Frye. And I always wondered why I understood these things. And a quote that stayed with me for decades was the idea that all literature is like silt laid down in a stream, right? The Bible is laid down, and on top of it is literature that follows since. And within each are these these connections, these strings that attach each other. That's why I mentioned, right, to William James and St. John of the Cross, and I mean even jump forward to William Styron in the 90s. There's a lot of lessons to be had from this book because it mentions some things that were held to be true, that some people didn't agree with, that have been since shown to be incorrect. So by accident, I was given a pretty advanced education in English literature and literary criticism because I never forgot about Northrop Frye. And the reason why I mention it more recently is because being a Westerner, being an English speaker, I can't ignore how important the mythology. I've mentioned Joseph Campbell and his connection. He's another archetypal critic. He opens up James Joyce and the East comparing the West. It's really quite beautiful. Everything that they highlight and share. But what I'm starting to realize is a lot of them are failing at true archetypal criticism because they tend to, say for example, like Carl Jung, he looked to the East but didn't realize that there isn't a great difference between us, East and West. The only difference is culture, habit, tradition, right? So he looked to the East and he saw this unity of community that was missing in the West. But what he missed was the self-loathing that permeates just about every aspect of our being in the West, something that is foreign to the Eastern consciousness. Right? So they tend to vilify their own cultures and deify ones that they're more enamored with. But for me, this is what surprised me, particularly today, is I realized I'm doing the same thing for trauma as I've been doing with philosophy of the nature of self, right? As a Yogacaran, I'm trying to bring together all of these different philosophies of the nature of self, of consciousness, of meaning, of value, perception of reality, the nature of trauma, as I say, pretty much all of this, even St. John of the Cross, his secret contemplation, his secret wisdom, whatever you might want to call it, whatever he might call it, depending on where in the poem you are, it's all the same thing. It's the same idea as the course I'm in right now. I'm learning about the Mahadevi. That would be the Devi Mahatmya. It's an Indian text filled with essentially aphorisms, in a sense, that are also mantras that can also be used as. It's incredibly complicated, yet so very, very simple. It's about bringing one's focus to the present, about being, being introspective and using both calm and insight in balance to study yourself, your reactions, reality, and your interaction with, right, the cause and effect, the nature of self, all this jazz. So for me, I see no difference. This is what blows me away. I'm talking to a buddy of mine, and I actually had to joke, and I said, listen, I apologize that I'm tending towards more Bible references, but I said I could give you other references. It's just for me, and arguably for him as well, being Westerners, I mean, the example I give, I can say Shakti all day. And unless you understand Sanskrit, it's going to be a waste of time. Like this course I'm in, I can't believe it. I love the professor, but it shocks me at how much Sanskrit he's using, and I'm even more shocked at how much I understand. It's a beautiful thing. It's very esoteric, yet at the same time he's quite open with the truth that it's also exoteric. It's very, very obscure, like he says. You could continue to dive deeper and deeper and deeper into the text, but at its surface, it is as simple as can be, right? Which many things are, but I digress. So this book, which, like I said, I picked completely cold, Darkness Visible. It's a memoir of madness by William Styron. But what's funny is it almost acts as a template for me to show archetypal criticism, the universality of this experience, as well as maybe teach a little bit about what has been going on, what we've missed. So as I said, the first page, I just wrote down, I noticed archetypal criticism. These stories are universal. Those are the notes I made. Also by William Styron, Lie Down in Darkness, The Long March, Set This House on Fire, The Confessions of Nat Turner, Sophie's Choice, and This Quiet Dust. I'm going to mention this later because the importance of particularly his first work, which made him well known, and I think that's pretty much what made his career, but how it was translated into France, and really he went to France for his actual first experience, right? So on the next page, he just dedicated it to his wife, Rose. And I love that because he said if it wasn't for his Rose, his wife, his stone, his rock, his support, his community, his Sangha, he never would have got through this. And I do not disagree that if it were not for my wife, I would not be here. She is who deserves all the credit when I achieve what I achieve, what I have achieved. She deserves all of the credit. So he says to Rose, and I said, I read Cold a la Mortimer Adler's Choosing a Book Cold from his book How to Read. He talks about how to choose a book cold. I did that because yesterday I was actually speaking with somebody who said completely like I didn't say anything at all. And he mentioned how he had a professor who said, that because people aren't reading books anymore, he fears that we're going to lose our identity, our consciousness, something like that. It got us into the discussion that I've talked about, how Nietzsche said, if man were to go into the woods and have no need for language, what would happen to his self, his consciousness, his being, right? And I argue he's wrong with that because it's culture, even. You strip away your culture, then you strip away the meaning in your language. And if you strip away the sufficiency in language, are you not stripping away your identity, your soul, yourself, who you are? I've said this before. The Canadian identity is not that different from the self-identity, how you identify the self and the other, the I and the self, to Jung. It's very similar to the via negativo, this idea of I define myself by what I'm not. Right? Do you get that? So this is the exact same idea, right? So for me, him having mentioned this, that people aren't reading books anymore, and it's funny because I actually I recorded a little idea about this a while back, where I said that Mortimer Adler would be rolling in his grave today because he exactly shared how to do that, how to pick a book cold. And never would he have realized that there would come a time, and this is exactly what this person said, almost like they listened to my podcast and they were repeating it word for word, this idea that never would he have realized that nobody would be choosing to read a book cold, right? Like even the number of people who are still reading for pleasure, they tend to not be reading cold. They tend to be reading something that's popular or something that was recommended, or it's a series, or even something like me they've already read before. So this idea of picking up something cold, or just having read everything and you want to try something new or something different, or there ain't something around, I mean, that just doesn't happen. Nowadays, at best, that would be a newspaper or a magazine someone might pick up, right? So I just made a note, but it ended up being so apropos, so absolutely apropos, this book. It wasn't just, in fact, I made a note here that this modern malaise that I have been bandying about may not be so new, right? Depression, aridity, angst, malaise. Are they not synonyms? And do they not predate any of the literature I've mentioned? So the book opens up, the author's notes. He said this book began as a lecture given in Baltimore in May 1989, so that had been 4 years after his most extreme experience of depression, where he was hospitalized. It was at a symposium on affective disorders, sponsored by the Department of Psychiatry at John Hopkins University School of Medicine. He said greatly expanded. It became an essay in Vanity Fair. But the note I made here was a trip to Paris when all this came to a head. But he said, despite the exceptionally ample amount of space I was given by the magazine, he said there is inevitably a limit. So I like this because, once again, this is also a theory that I subscribe to. Parkinson's law applied to theories. Right? Parkinson's law says the amount of time you give a task, the amount of time it takes to complete a task will grow to fill the time allotted to complete the task. And I argue it's the same when it comes to theories. This is why I've mentioned before I adore Carl Jung's seminars, because he realized that you only have so much time to get these ideas across to the audience, so you can't mess about, right? So a book, you have multiple chapters, but you know what I mean? Oh yeah, sorry about that. Headset was squeaking. I hope it didn't go through in the recording. So the opener is darkness visible. He has a quote from the book of Job. And I quote, "For the thing which I greatly feared is come upon me, and that which I was afraid of is come unto me. I was not in safety, neither had I rest, neither was I quiet, yet trouble came." Right? Job. I do enjoy the book of Job for the same idea. But it opens up, opens up chilly evening, late October 1985. He said, "The struggle with the disorder in my mind," he said, "it might have a fatal outcome." Then he proceeds to talk about, in the 50s, this Wanderjahr. So he's a very well-off, well-to-do student, wandered through Europe, or I don't know his specifics on this, but he definitely was very well off from a very early age. He experienced Europe with a lot of money, right? Because he goes down and he talks about how much he enjoyed Hotel Washington. He said it was a very modest means. I'm sure it was. A Paris hotel, right? And so he talks about having just published his first novel, and he was a celebrity. But he proceeds to say, though one of a very low rank, since few of the Americans in Paris had heard of my book, let alone read it. So you weren't a celebrity, bruv, right? I mean, there you go again. See, the problem begins with self. He was trying to build theater instead of realizing what was really going on, right? So he goes on, he talks about having been back in Paris, right? 40 years later, he had come fatally full circle. Again, the angst and the drama of which he writes some of this stuff is insane. So he proceeds and said, "I would never recapture a lucidity that was slipping away from me with terrifying speed." He's just talking about the lost hope, right? He was starting to suffer from a malaise, a depression that, right, he didn't feel like he would ever get out of. He said, "Of the many dreadful manifestations of the disease, it was the sense of self-hatred, a failure of self-esteem, a worthlessness, his dank joylessness." I mean, that speaks of Job again, right? He mentions trying to restore his ego. Yeah, a lot of this does go back to ego. I love, though, that his first book, this book that supposedly had made him a little more well-known, is called Lie Down in Darkness, but it was translated into French as Un lit de ténèbres, which translates as obscurity or darkness or opacity or ignorance. But think of it, I would translate it as obscure angst, right? A bed of obscure angst. That's beautiful. That's our life. That's our lot. What is our life but a bed of obscure angst, right? So the French title, way better than his original. So he goes on, talks about some of his experience. He was offered an award for this, and so he was back in Paris to accept an award for something that he wrote. And he talks about how this was his first experience with what he realized to be, clinical depression, something he was really dealing with. So he mentions depression as a disorder of mood. He says it's mysterious and painful and elusive in the way it becomes known to the self. He says it verges close to being beyond description, right? A gloom, the blues, as we say. He goes on and talks about how prevalent it is, but they don't give many individuals a hint of the illness in its catastrophic form, right? So depression's common, but this severe sadness of what St. John of the Cross writes about, or what Jung writes about in Liber Novus, or Nietzsche writes about in Zarathustra, or, you could say Proust in Search of Lost Time, or William James in his Radical Empiricism, or even his Varieties of Religious Experience, Albert Camus. There's no end to these examples, because he talks about this near violent denouement of December. Obviously, he says this Paris trip had retained a notable meaning for him, because he proceeds to go on and talking about how he was aided by a minor tranquilizer, halcyon. So in chapter 1, he's calling it a minor halcyon, where he proceeds to explain that it had caused his hospitalization. But he says he was in fair spirits. He was using the halcyon for his insomnia. But he said such cheer would wane. His habitual pretense, which he knew meant very little, because he would certainly feel ghastly before nightfall. Right? He's really quite interesting. He wakes up with a little more hope and happiness in the morning, and throughout the day he becomes more and more separated from his joy, from his passion. Right? So at about this time, he said he abruptly abandoned whiskey and all other intoxicants that June. Well, he didn't give up the benzodiazepines, so not all other intoxicants. I don't know whether other intoxicants he was using, but this black and white, like the carnivore diet, is difficult. A lot of people can see some benefit from major changes like that, but for many people it can make things a lot worse. Right? So he goes on and talks about how he'd read the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, considered himself an autodidact in medicine. But he goes on and says that he felt that he'd always subconsciously rejected or ignored the proper knowledge related to depression and signs of it in himself. He said it may have cut too close to the psychic bone. So I would call that willful ignorance or aversion, was the note I made in the margin here. So the next paragraph down, I highlight extensive reading, and he had absorbed many fascinating and troubling facts, but he, however, could not put them to practical use. I believe that. That's why I had to learn how to do analytical reading, and even more so this archetypal criticism, because I needed to take what worked from one and leave the rest, like I've said, right? Take the cannolis and leave the gun, right? Take what is of use going forward and leave what was an adaptation that is no longer beneficial. So he goes on and talks about the fact that the serious depression is not readily treatable. Right? So I said untreatable with a question mark. Right? So I wonder, because he talks about diabetes and glucose, and yet this being from the early 90s, late 80s, I guess he didn't realize how desperately important diet was in helping depression. The new science we have with omega fats, right? But he quickly goes on and talks about these major stages of depression possess no quickly available remedy. No, because the remedy is hope, it's trust, right? So without hope, without trust, we're lost in a quagmire of, well, the truth of suffering that is our existence. And later on down he says his systematology and very little that legitimately suggests the possibility of a quick rescue. So I made a note that no, there's no quick rescue, but a path, a habit, not a pill, right? So I call it not a pill cure. I call it a habit cure, right? That's what we need to do. Later I make notes of this. The beauty of the mind is how plastic it is. So yes, we'll lay down these habits that can be based on trauma or depressive perception, but the beauty of this truth is since it's so easy for us to lay down these habits, these depressive habits, it's also easy for us to replace them with more beneficial ones. So on the next page we have the disease of depression remains a great mystery. So I say yes, it is, but the source of the depravity that leads to it, whatever, is it a disconnection from joy, from meaning, from value? This is this archetypal criticism. If instead of me looking at his story as one story of depression or trauma, because you'll see as the story goes on, it's very obviously a story of trauma as much as it is depression. If we look at this story with an archetypal view, can we not see the universality of his story? A truth that transcends the ages, transcends patience, transcends even literature, to a truth of our suffering, the truth of our liberation from the said suffering. Right? So he goes down, he talks about back in the day, right, to bleed or not to bleed. And he says it almost defines in itself the inexplicable nature of depression and the difficulty of its treatment. Right? And I argue just like trauma today. Right? And his mention of bleeding back in the 18th century, he didn't go into it in great detail, but it is very apropos because they were treating diseases that they didn't even understand yet. So it's no surprise that a lot of their treatments were just, shots in the dark. Right, so I like how he mentioned this here. He says, so if we compare our knowledge with Columbus's discovery of America, he says, America yet unknown, we are still down on that little island in the Bahamas. Right, so if he's talking about depression, I wrote that if we're going to apply this, compare our knowledge of trauma, not depression, to Columbus's discovery of America, Columbus would still be in Spain. Right, so remember that. If we were going to apply this same metaphor, if we apply it to depression, medicine is still in the Bahamas. They haven't made it to America yet. They still don't understand, nor do they have treatments that are successful in a broad range of situations and patients. So I would argue for trauma, we're still in Spain because we don't even know what we're doing, right? And then it proceeds on and it talks about, in my reading, I've learned, for example, that in at least one interesting aspect of my own case was atypical. And so my note is, well, aren't we all, bruv? That's my I believe will be a big, hopefully in addition to this understanding here, this idea of a neurodivergent mind or an a typical mind, a neurotypical mind, is a misunderstanding of the truth that we are all atypical. And until we realize that we are all atypical, we're not going to be able to fix this problem, because until then we have this fantasy of what's normal and what's abnormal, instead of realizing we're all on a spectrum of abnormality, right? And then I made a little note here. He said, most people who begin to suffer from the illness are laid low in the morning with such malefic effect that they are unable to get out of bed. I love that, malefic. Great word, right? Such terrible, well, it's, I think, a synonym for angst, I would say, right? They feel better only as the day wears on, right? See, some. And it's funny that I wrote that, some, because here he goes. But my situation was just the reverse. That's me, right? I'm very similar to that. I can lose sleep in the morning because of my trauma, because of my PTSD. But I usually feel much better in the morning. And just like him, so we must share something with our cortisol cycle or whatever it might be, because I get worse as the day progresses. The mid-afternoon is probably one of my worst, but I think that's because I tend to be alone at that period. Um, Not as much distraction. But I tend to get a little bit better as the time goes on. It's almost like, being able to give up on the day is what the depressive sees as positive. But I didn't seem to make any notes on that page, so we'll proceed to the next page. I just put fate or self-fulfilling because he kept talking about on this page, so I apologize. So I just made a note. So in this page, when he was talking about his symptoms throughout the day, he was actually self-fulfilling his prophecy, because he'd get up in the morning, he'd be okay, but he'd keep reminding himself that he would get worse as the day would go on, and he said it would become stifling anxiety. Yeah, it's catastrophizing, as so many people do. On the next page, he was talking about how he planned on using some of the money that he was going to be given for this award here in Paris. And talk about coming from money. He talked about using some of the money. He was going to donate it to some charities in France and France-American charities. But he was going to keep some for himself for tickets on the Concorde the next day so he could get right back to the United States, because he had made appointments to see a psychiatrist back in America. You can well imagine what just the phone calls alone would have cost from Paris to America in 1986, never mind trying to get a hold of a psychiatrist, right? And he proceeds on and he says, he said he had a reluctance to accept reality, that his mind was dissolving. And I made a note about his fatalism. He feels like a victim here. That's what he's showing. Instead of looking to bear his burden, whatever that may be, accept his lot, he was catastrophizing and making it all worse. Right? And so I argue on this page, he's talking about executive dysfunction. So this man is suffering from trauma and the resultant adaptations from trauma, because he's not just fearful in a depressive sort of way. He is unable to act in an executive dysfunction sort of way. Right? It's interesting if you want to look in that, right? Procrastination versus executive dysfunction. I spent 30 years being convinced that I was a procrastinator, but I've come to realize it's actually executive dysfunction related to childhood trauma, early trauma, and for me, trauma has been it's been constant, not constant. It's always it's been regular or much more. Well, it's been a companion on my journey in life. Let's just leave it at that. So he goes on, he talks about a lot of literature there's available concerning depression. He says a lot of it might be breezily optimistic, spreading assurances that nearly all depressive states will be stabilized or reversed if only the suitable antidepressant can be found, right? And so I make a note, not all, not even with antidepressants, right? There's an actual term, and I mention it later, intractable or medication-averse depression. That's just because, and sadly, when they approve medication, it only has to be 70% effective or thereabouts for it to be approved. So that says that 30% or more of people are not going to benefit from the medication. It is a simple fact. But later on, he talks about how the doctor uses placebo to work around this, right? So down later, he talks about his hope for flying home to the doctor because he wanted the doctor to whisk his malaise away with miraculous medications, right? And so I made a note, heal me. So many people say that, and does that not sound like Alice in Wonderland, this idea, or was it Alice Through the Looking Glass? But I wrote, heal thyself. And I love this because let's talk about heal thyself and know thyself. Know thyself is a Greek expression that goes all the way back to the Delphic oracle. And in Greek, it means you yourself, right? Come to know, come to understand. Right? To heal thyself. as I've said before, when it comes to Buddhism, there is no tool, there is no practice, there is nothing external that can help you understand the nature of self and your relation to other. Nothing outside of yourself. It's all within. Right? So he goes on and talks about that he's hardly able to believe that he possessed such ingenuous hope, right? So that he thought that the medication could pull him out of this. Began because he was so fatalistic, right? He felt that he was Job, only worse, because Job never completely lost faith. He began to question, but he never lost faith. Right? So it goes on and says he was unaware of the trouble and peril that lay ahead. He did end up getting pretty sick. So later on down the page he says, but my behavior was really the result of the illness. This was how he acted around other people. He said he was very distant and he had a hard time even focusing, speaking, caring about anything he used to find pleasure in, right? And so that's why I said, like trauma informed adaptations, right? This gentleman was suffering more from trauma than anything else, in my opinion, but we're just talking about this stuff. We're not diagnosing anything. He's already passed. So he talks about some of these sinister hallmarks of confusion, failure of mental focus, lapse of memory. All of those are symptoms of stress, symptoms of trauma. And again, I'm not specifically speaking of trauma. It can be just his catastrophizing, thinking that his malaise is never going to get better or it's going to keep getting worse. That can re-traumatize him over and over again, himself, right? Just this, I love that he put it down here because I love this word, bifurcation of mood, right? Think about that, this bifurcation of mood, right? That's why I mentioned Kipling's If, the poem, because the one line that says to treat triumph and disaster as the imposters they are, right? That's what we're talking about here. When you have this bifurcation of mood, it's not admitting the fact that you can't always be happy, so that obviously means you won't always be unhappy, but this belief that you're the victim of your own moods. That's what it's saying there, this bifurcation of moods, right? He says, lucidity of sorts in the early hours of the day, gathering murk in the afternoon and evening. It must have been during the previous, and he goes on and on, talking about how bad and how much he suffers. And he said something that was this experience with someone who was giving him an award, and he was going to forego the dinner with him, and she was really upset. And he ended up having to say, oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. He said malentendu, and that means not heard properly, but, right. He goes on and says that he says, I'm sick. Un problème psychiatrique. So he says he has a psychiatric problem, right? So supposedly she understood that, but they were still a little bit cold, obviously, because if you're giving an award to someone who's, you might be a little worried, right? But on the next page, talk about panic and dislocation, and a sense that my thought processes were being engulfed by a toxic and unnameable tide that obliterated any enjoyable response to the living world. Right? And so I said, same, right? The day grows long. But this is the aridity of the soul. This is what St. John of the Cross was talking about. This exact thing, this panic and dislocation, right? This realization that you're disconnected from what you used to be connected to. Your joys, your passions, your value, your meaning, right? Being engulfed by a toxic and unnameable tide that obliterated any enjoyable response to the living world. That's what St. John of the Cross talks about, that there's nothing in this world that brings you joy or passion. Right? So he talks about this feeling in his mind, a sensation that is close to, but indescribably different from actual pain. It's not wrong. I liken it to the SIRS, it's systematic inflammatory response syndrome. I personally think that there is a psychological version of this response. The University of Texas proved there is a arguably a lifelong systematic inflammatory response from traumatic brain injury. So why not one from psychological injury, right? That's tied to the cortisol. I think he mentions this later, but why not, right? The psyche and pain is not unlike this psychological inflammatory response syndrome, where just simply thoughts, feelings, expressions can lead to physical manifestations. Why not pain, right? He talks about if the pain were readily describable, right? More people would understand this, right? Because words fail. He goes on, talks about a comprehension. It slips from your fingers because it's, right? Incomprehension is usually due not to a failure of sympathy, but to a basic inability of healthy people to imagine a form of torment so alien to everyday experience. But later he does explain that maybe they just don't want to admit how common and maybe even they suffer with, right? Because he says the pain for himself, he equated to drowning or suffocation. And this is beautiful. This is where he mentions William James, one of my favorite psychologists, philosophers, authors. He said he battled with depression for many years, gave up on his search for adequate portrayal, implying its near impossibility when he wrote the varieties of religious experience. So, quote, it is a positive and active anguish, a sort of physical neuralgia, wholly unknown to normal life. That's why I call it a malaise, or a daemon, a specter that hovers over you, or like Aldous Huxley's veil of consciousness that is laid upon us, acting as a barrier to access to anything that is of value or meaning in our life, right? Because I made a note, William James suffered depression. That's important to understand, because in his varieties of religious experience, he talks about these sick souls, right? That some people are just fine with life. They understand and things are great. Everything's awesome. Then there are others that need to come to God or need to have some sort of an epiphany, an understanding, a satori in Japanese, a moment of clarity, a moment of awakening, to become what William James called the second born. And then there's people like me, who the happy fiction, Carl Jung's happy fiction doesn't work for me because it's fiction. I realized the truth of my condition as Job did. I wondered for a long time until I came to the understanding that our solution is acceptance. It's to carry our burden. And once you accept these things, the pain begins to wane. Even physical limitations can begin to be. I don't want to go into this. It sounds hocus pocusy, but we've seen this before. It's a placebo thing, right? So, meditation is what I'm getting at here. It's not much different. Contemplation, meditation, prayer, whatever you want to call it. Modern science has shown that even a few moments of meditation can cause our resting inflammatory markers in our blood to reduce significantly. Right? So that's what I'm getting at. This idea of accepting our lot, amor fati, right? The love your fate. I say love your faith, even, right? Because fati is fate, but faith and trust all being synonyms, right? So have trust in your faith. Have faith in your trust, right? And love your fate, right? Treat the good and the bad as the same, right? Not having no passion, like many people misunderstand Stoicism, but finding that central path. Not insufficient, not excessive, but applying the correct understanding in the correct situation, right? So he goes on, he talks about rational thought was usually absent from my mind at such times, hence a trance. That's what I'm saying. All of these practices are an attempt for us to be more present, right? And to understand who we are, where we are, what we should do, what's best for us. Right. And at the bottom of that page, I can think of no more opposite word, more apropos word, for this state of being, a condition of helpless stupor in which cognition was replaced with that positive and active anguish. Replaced by that positive and active anguish. Really no different to St. John of the Cross or just anything else. So he talked about an inability to sleep. He mentions the time later too, but I say this is very common to people with PTSD, that the witching hour, as it were, for PTSD, 3, 4, 5 in the morning. I've seen that. Look at Jocko Willink. He gets it up at 4:30 every morning, and he tries to play it off as that's his routine. I wonder if there's a connection to his traumatic past, but we'll go on. He talks about his afternoon insomnia. I made a note of that because that is actually quite troubling, because he mentioned about not being able to sleep in the afternoon when you're tired. Later he reiterates this idea of being both sleepy and an insomniac. It's right. It's really quite terrible. So I said not being able to nap is troubling, right? This idea of a full-time exhaustion. I mean, I was coming off of that myself. I, like Nietzsche, used all sorts of different remedies trying to solve it, when I'm hoping I've come upon the truth that it's this malaise, this angst that robs us of our passion, of our soul, of our energy, because we have to spend so much energy on just suppressing it, right? So on the next page, I highlight the weather of depression is unmodulated. It's a light brownout, right? What did I put there? Oh, I mentioned the darkness of the soul, right? The aridity of the soul. That's exactly what St. John of the Cross is talking about when he's talking about the aridity of the soul. The weather of depression is unmodulated. It's a light brownout. So it's like a lack of passion in what you used to love. And then he goes on. So I made a little note, not just depression, trauma, maybe even some autoimmune. This is really early because he talked about self-loathing. In this page here, just his examples of what he was experienced. Sounds very much like trauma. Some of it even has symptoms of an autoimmune. At the bottom of the page, he talked about he didn't have an appetite in this grand plateau de fruits de mer. That just means it was like a multi-tiered seafood thing that most people would be like, oh my God, it's so awesome. It was placed before him. He failure even to produce forced laughter. And then virtual total failure of speech. So what he's explaining here is essentially disassociation, maybe even a form of depersonalization and derealization, right? I find there's a problem in the DSM because trauma is so ubiquitous. It is so easy to lump somebody into BPD or some of these other manic, when in reality it might be something as simple as trauma, anxiety, depression, right? All of these causes brain fog and can be this cause of unconsciousness, like Jung wrote about. Remember I mentioned that most of our troubles in this world, according to Jung, could be traced to the fact that most people walk around completely unconscious the majority of the time. And then on the last paragraph of the first chapter, he said he had a ferocious inwardness of the pain produced an immense distraction. Well, yes, yeah, it's the same as with almost any disease, because when you feel you're a victim, like Job, the book of Job, if you feel you're a victim, then your suffering is worse, exponentially worse. Right? And he makes a mention of Albert Camus and Romain Gary. We'll see what he mentions about them later. Camus, in his novel The Stranger, L'étrangère, not probably what later he mentions The Fall, I think maybe more apropos to what we're talking about here. But The Stranger is well known, same with The Plague. So he says, he said he was a writer who had wed moral passion to a style of great beauty, and whose unblinking vision is capable of frightening the soul to its marrow. All that's saying is Camus had a knack for highlighting what life was really like. Kind of like an early modernist, or I don't know, a late modernist, whatever you want to call him, applying this to philosophy instead of fiction or what have you. So seeing him finding new ways to express the human condition, right? So he said this in The Stranger, the cosmic loneliness of Meursault, the hero of that novel, right, really resonated with him, right? Because he says between Meursault's frigid solitude and the plight of Nat Turner, a book that he was working on. So he sees the archetypes between all of this suffering, right? And he goes on and says, likewise condemned and abandoned by man and God. So he sees Meursault and Nat Turner as both people, both of them being disconnected from their connection to God, to the self, and to others. In Greek, that's koinonia. You can look that up. That's a very interesting philosophy, the idea that the connection needs to be nurtured or respected, whatever you want to call it. Connection between man and God and man, right? We're all connected, right? And that's what we're coming to here, this idea. And that's Job as well, right? Feeling abandoned, condemned, disconnected from man and God. And he goes on and talks about his essay on the reflections on the guillotine. He found that very eye-opening. He said he found Camus a cleanser of the intellect, and he was ridding him of countless sluggish ideas, right? So I said I found my own opinion, right? So this is acceptance. So unlike him, I found my own understanding of some of this philosophy in Camus and otherwise. I found it myself. Camus didn't share with me a philosophy that resonated and changed my perspective. Camus' revolutionary philosophy allowed me to see the importance of revolutionizing your own thinking, if that makes sense. The idea that you must carve for yourself your own path. What Emerson wrote about, that influenced Nietzsche and Jung. The fact that all new ideas, all great thinkers are ostracized or considered weird or crazy or outlandish, because all great new ideas, anything that challenges the status quo, and remember, the status quo is how it is, not how it could be or how it should be. So anyone that challenges the prevailing system is going to be considered dangerous. He goes on, talks about a French, I believe it was a French author, Romain Gary. Romain is a very French name, Roman. He talks about that he was going to meet Camus, and Albert Camus read his book, Un lit de ténèbres. He said he admired it in French. I don't know how well the translation was. But sadly, Camus had been in an automobile accident and died at the age of 46, so he wasn't actually able to meet him. And so this loss, again, this is what do you call it? Mourning is like. A lot of people believe that we mourn the future, the ideas that we thought would be the future. That's what we're mourning. right? Very selfish in that sense, but it is. We have to understand that for a lot of us, we're not mourning the loss of the individual, we're mourning the loss of the individual in our lives. And he goes on, he's talking about the beginning of the myth of Sisyphus, closer to my preferred Camus novel. I like the myth of Sisyphus. And he quotes, "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, that of suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy." And I'm sharing this because this is often misunderstood. Right? We have to picture Sisyphus happy. Right? So this isn't about actual, taking one's life. This is, you are essentially committing suicide if you don't embrace the good and the bad as ordered. This is the eternal recurrence of Nietzsche. This is amor fati. It's not different. And so I made a note that no, our job is not this idea of one or the other. Our job is to make it worthy. That is our lot and the solution to this malaise. So if we see ourselves as a victim, like Sisyphus, then there is no way out of this. But if you see yourself as a divine creature, acting in a divine manner for a greater cause, as I said, from the movie Secondhand Lions, sometimes the most important truths to be held are the ones that we can't know for certain, that truth and beauty and love conquer all, that evil is conquered by good, and that power and money have no value when it comes to what is truly worthy in life. Right? He goes on, mentions the fall, right? Talking about how it was a lawyer who was behaving very much like a man in the throes of clinical depression. And it is interesting because you can listen to the very end of the fall and you get a lot of this philosophy, Camus' philosophy of embracing our lot, amor fati. I have no doubt that Camus is a big fan of Nietzsche's philosophy as well. So he goes on, there's a little mention here of his innocence of the very existence of the disease. So he was a big fan of Camus, but he never really saw depression in himself. And that's why I said I've spent the last year or two trying to learn how to read and use analytical study to get into some of this stuff so that I can use it in my own life, right? And so it goes on, Camus, Romain told him, occasionally hinted at his own very deep despondency and had spoken of suicide. I love that because the word despondency is a synonym to disassociation. Being despondent is a lack of joy. It's the obscure night of the soul, despondency. And on the next page, he mentions... despite its abiding tone of melancholy, a sense of triumph of life over death is at the core of the myth of Sisyphus. With this austere message, in the absence of hope, we must still struggle to survive. I go one step further and I say that in the absence of meaning, we can make our search for meaning of value our meaning. We can make the search for meaning our ethos, our goal, our telos. Everything, our meaning, our value, can be simply the search for meaning. When meaning and value is arbitrary, it makes it simple, but it's Kierkegaard's leap of faith, that you have to have not the leap of faith in anything external, but Jung's and Nietzsche's leap of faith in oneself. You are the Übermensch. You are the Oversoul. You are the creator and the destroyer. You are Vishnu and Shiva and Brahman and. You are all of the above, right? So I made a note, picture him happy and content. That's what we need to do. You need to be Sisyphus. You need to picture yourself as happy and content because you can never be happy and content all the time. So Steele, what was his name? I can't remember his name. The book, he's a PhD. The book is Hardwiring Happiness, and that's his solution. He says, because of our negativity bias, and because of the rarity of contentment, of happiness, of positivity, our secret is just highlight the positive. Don't ignore the negative, but make sure to put extra highlight on the positive, right? But a big part of that is you have to be all in, because unless you want to see meaning and value, you won't see it. Right? So he goes on and he says, I love this, just this line, right? He said, he felt it from time to time, this laden and poisonous mood, the color of verdigris, so incongruous in the midst of the lush New England summer. It doesn't fit. It's a little weird, but I do. It was a nice turn of the phrase. So he's talking about a Russian Jew born in Lithuania, Romain Gary, seemed possessed of an Eastern European melancholy. He said he found it hard to tell the difference between his melancholy and depression, right? But he said he was able to perceive a flicker of the desperate state of mind which had been described to him by Camus. So this is the author's buddy in France, Romain Gary, who is suffering from this same malaise. So he goes on and he talks about how Gary and his wife, Jean Seburg, was an Iowa-born actress. But what's really sad, when he talks about having been over at Romain's place for a dinner date, and his wife Jean came in, he said, all her once fragile and luminous blonde beauty had disappeared into a puffy mask. She moved like a sleepwalker, said little, and had the blank gaze of someone tranquilized, or drugged, or both. And later he said, yes, she was on antidepressants. And if you consider what time this was, when Prozac first came out, I remember I was in high school when Prozac came out, and half the people thought it made people out of monsters, and then the other half, it just made zombies out of people, right? So he said Jean was being treated for the disorder that afflicted him, and he mentioned something about antidepressant medications. So I just made a note for myself that this seems to be the the takeaway for me so far in the book is we need to get away from pills, right? Because they're pushing pills, not skills. The way to get out of this is not with pills, but with skills. Pills, not skills, is what they're doing. I screwed that up. I apologize. The way out of this is by teaching skills, not prescribing pills, right? So my note here is they're giving pills, not skills. I apologize. I meant to say we should be helping people with skills, not pills. So later he was talking about his sleep, both day and night, his mood. He does mention possibly something related to the circadian cycle. It's actually more likely connected to the cortisol cycle, it seems, stress, and So he came about talking about the hours, dinner time and before. Between dinner time and before midnight, he started to feel a little bit better. He says sometimes he felt close to being reasonably sane, which is odd because it was in those times that he could have actually developed a connection to things that mattered, but neither here nor there. Really sad is he said a little over a year after their encounter in Connecticut, his buddy's wife took an overdose of pills and was found dead in a parked car in a cul-de-sac off of Paris Avenue, and her body had lain for many days. Right? She had lost all hope. And of course, the loss of his wife made this gentleman, Romain, it deepened his depression, rendered him nearly helpless, he said. He said he changed. Even though he was in his mid-60s, before he was a lot more passionate. But he said he began to sound very old. He had what he calls a voice of depression because he saw it in himself, right? So he said, this is interesting, he said, let's see, yeah, he says he spoke to him, but he never saw him again. He said a buddy, his Claude Guillemard, Francois' father, so that was his French publisher's father, had recollected to him how in 1980, only a few hours after another lunch where the two of them had talked, so this is Romain Gary and Claude Gallimard, they had a nice talk between two old friends. It was composed, casual, even lighthearted, he said. Certainly anything but somber, but Romain Gary, twice winner of the Prix Goncourt, which is one of these awards synonymous, the result of his having gleefully tricked the critics. I don't know what that's a reference to. But he said he was a hero of the Republic, a valorous recipient of the Croix de Guerre. He was a diplomat, a bon vivant. That means bon vivant is good liver. Like he had a passion for life. That's what he lost, right? And he said after their lunch, he went home and put a bullet through his brain, right? So I just made a note in the margin that this is a lesson for all of us, that value and meaning comes and leaves us all. Yeah. So he said for a while he had thoughts of death blowing through his mind like icy gusts of wind. He said he was tormented by this idea of people in the grip of a severe affliction. And again, I made another note of Job. That's where that lesson of the book of Job is how to carry our burden, right? How to remain faithful in the face of doubt and uncertainty. That's the definition of trauma, right? Unresolved uncertainty. That's free energy. That's surprise in Carl Friston's free energy philosophy, that we try to predict the outcome, right? Cause and effect. And it'll always be a surprise. But when we don't accept reality for what it is, it can cause essentially a trauma. And this surprise is unresolved uncertainty that lacks in acceptance, right? So he said at the very end of chapter 2, the fundamental question of philosophy, right? He's referencing back to Camus, right? And I just say lost hope, trust. Camus is not losing your passion, right? That's like, think about it. I mean, if life is inherently meaningless, well, that's what Camus was getting at. If you truly believe that, then why are you even here? Right? That's all it takes. It's that thought experiment that I did when I was about 14 that made me realize I was not the center of the universe. Sitting in a cafeteria, looking around going, well, all the world are actors upon a stage. So what are the odds that these people here are just here for my entertainment? Well, the way I saw it is that was pretty unlikely, right? And just not in a self-deprecating way. I followed it through and I went, what are the odds that these people, their existence just disappears when I'm not around? Now, that's pretty zero chance. Well, do they go ahead and continue to live their life, right, to keep up the narrative? Well, that gets infinitely complicated to the point where why would the entire universe set up this incredible complexity just to delude me into thinking that I'm the center of the universe, or worse yet, I am the center of the universe and all of this is just for my own benefit? That is the epitome of delusion, of illusion, Maya in Sanskrit, the Maha Maya. The great illusion is believing in the independent existence of self. So off to chapter 3. The first highlights I made was he's mentioning Abby Hoffman, and he said he'd always been careless with pills. When Abby Hoffman died, his brother tried to justify that it wasn't suicide. by mentioning that he had always been careless with pills and that he would never have left his family bereft. But sadly, the toxicologist had said he had taken about 150 phenobarbitals. So yeah, no, that was probably definitely suicide, right? So he says it's quite natural that people closest to the suicide victim so frequently and feverishly hasten to disclaim the truth, the sense of implication, of personal guilt, the idea that one might have prevented the act or have taken certain precautions, how somehow if you'd behaved differently, yada, yada, yada. So the note I made was, true depressed do not share the totality of their suffering. So we should never be surprised when this stuff happens, because those who are really suffering don't share the level, certainly not the true level of their suffering with others. So it will always, always be a surprise, right? And the other note I made, and this is a very Canadian reference, but you can look this up, like Troy Herchebes. He's world famous for his bear suit. He made a number of different bear suits where he'd be run down by a truck, shot with shotguns, even knocked senseless by a tree, all in an attempt to be able to study bears in a safe manner. But in the end, after many years of struggle, I knew the man personally, many years of struggle, he died in a car accident on the highway. Some people believe he drove into a gas truck. It could have been an accident. I mean, I know if you are from Northern Ontario, I mean, you can drive for 6 hours without seeing, civilization up there. So it's possible that he was tired, he fell asleep, but again, it's so true that, right? And I had a really close friend of mine who passed in a very similar situation. It was really early in the morning. He was out on icy roads. You wonder, like, should you have not gone into work that day, or should you have been driving slower, or should you have taken a different route, or there's so many things you wonder, right? So he mentions another person that he knew. What was his name? Randall Jarrell. And supposedly he might have stepped into traffic, right? Because once you looked into this, he had been hospitalized for depression previous, and he even slashed his wrists. Right? So it's amazing how universal this malaise is. Right? And so I just asked a question down at the bottom of this page. I said, what has kept me alive? I've never lost faith that I could overcome, or I guess I didn't realize that I could come to the understanding that I could bear my burden, and that it will not defeat me. So I highlight, he said, Randall Jarrett almost certainly killed himself. He said because he was so afflicted with depression that was so devastating that he could no longer endure the pain of it. Well, that's what a depressed person is. They're just looking to end the pain. And that's part of the reason that's kept me alive, because I never wanted to cause any pain in my family, even if they were the source of a lot of mine. Not something I was ever willing to do. So I made a note in the margin on that paragraph that lost trust, lost hope. Right. The next paragraph mentions Primo Levi, a remarkable Italian writer, survivor of Auschwitz, but at the age of 67, hurled himself down a stairwell in Turin, 1987. Right. So he said, I made a note here, to carry our burden, right? Because, I mean, he survived Auschwitz, so what happened in his life, right? Because he was a scholar and a well-known writer, his students wouldn't believe. And as he said here, they saw his suicide demonstrating a certain level of frailty. But it reminds me, and I think it's a combination of a movie and a Hemingway quote, this idea that we all have our breaking point. Oh, yes, it's Apocalypse Now, when they're talking about Colonel Kurtz, when he's deep in the jungle. And I believe it's a rewriting of Hemingway's idea that, right, we all have our breaking points, right? But some of us are stronger in those places after. Some of us break, but some of us can put our pieces back together, and we're stronger in those places, which is the next paragraph. So again, he's a writer, so I'm sure he understands Hemingway. I'm surprised he didn't mention it. But this idea that, it's not a guarantee, but it is likely you're going to go through this more than once, and that many people are actually more resilient after having survived their depressive episode. Right? So this, it sounds like platitude, but it's a truth that you have to have hope and faith. Right? So I just made a note here about trauma predisposed mood. I mean, if you look at Levi, because he survived his Auschwitz, he more likely was predisposed to other traumas, and that might have been what happened, right? Do I carry my burdens is the question I mentioned, right? So that's know thyself, right? So next, face a terrible absolute of self-destruction, right? This one's difficult because the fear of the dissolution of the self is common, because in Buddhism, you're meant to come to the understanding that the construct of the self is non-existent. Right? As Douglas Hofstadter said, I am a strange loop. Right? The self is a recursive loop, a self-referential recursive loop. I am. It's almost like ergo cogito, cogito ergo sum. I am because I think, and this idea. Not really. But he goes on and talks about, right, this touch of shame that can be attached to suicide and self-destruction, mental health, or even just giving up. Right? And I made a note that shame is death. And later in the book, you 100% hear that. Right? That the failure is to give way to the shame. It's not uncommon to feel that shame, but the failure would be to give in to it. Right? So he goes on and talks about, and I highlight here, the argument I put forth was fairly straightforward. The pain of severe depression is quite unimaginable to those who have not suffered it, and it kills in many instances because its anguish can no longer be borne. There's Job again, right? Can I bear my burdens? Right? I wrote, belief, they cannot bear it. That's it. It's just belief. I mean, really, the theory is we can bear anything. That's that story of may God grant me the strength to accept the things I cannot change, right? To bear my burdens, but also to have me not so traumatized by those burdens as to be able to act in such a way to change the things I can. I mean, that statement is a statement of the traumatized, of the depression. How you get past it, it's to accept the things that are a certainty and to change, to work with the things that are within our power to amend or what have you, to work with it. So again, I highlight here general awareness of the nature of this pain. That's what we're talking about here. It's the pain of lack of hope. It's the pain of disconnection. It's the pain of the fear of not having the strength to bear your burden. Not just the pain of the burden. Right? It's so common that those with chronic illness will end up with PTSD because of the time it can take to heal, even to get a diagnosis. I mean, certainly the suffering, and it's really quite common, right? So he says, hope is my note, hope. But he says medical intervention or hospitalization in many cases, most people survive, right? And so I mentioned the second born of William James. Yes, sometimes it takes a crisis for people to come to an understanding, right? And he mentions how it's different from, say, terminal cancer. So that's why I highlight the second born versus William James' Sick Souls, right? The reason why it is different is because not everyone can come to Jung's happy fiction, right? To believe that this pain is not guaranteed, but it's suffering that is a choice, right? So it's this leap of faith, again, from Soren Kierkegaard. It has nothing to do with God, has to do completely and wholly with our own ability to sustain ourselves, right? I said it causes healthy to look within, right? This idea that if these experiences like Job allows you to question your own faith in yourself, in this case, is that not an ability for you to find that same faith and hope to sustain yourself in these situations, right? I just made a note that all suppressed secrets become toxic. Well, all suppressed truths is the actual quote from Nietzsche. Because here it says, he said, whom the subject had been taboo, a matter of secrecy and shame. This idea of depression itself. Right? It's not just suicide, but even depression itself was something of shame that we wouldn't even talk about, because later he says that women are more susceptible to depression. And I asked the question, are they though? Or are they just more likely to seek help or admit that they have trouble, right? Then I mention, I highlight it's worthwhile to have invaded my own privacy, right? To make that privacy public, right? Because he was talking about his own experience with depression and how he found that it looked like it actually had helped, right? But it's that authenticity, right? It's that authenticity. That's where that modernism became so popular in novels, because finally there was some authenticity in what we read, right? The characters and the stories resonated for us because they had a truth in them, right? An experience that resonated, that, you know what I mean. So although as an illness, depression manifests certain unvarying characteristics, it also allows for many idiosyncrasies. I've been amazed at some of the freakish phenomena not reported by other patients. He says, wrought amid the twistings of my mind's labyrinth. Well, I made a little thing about the idiosyncrasies, mainly because what I've come to realize is more traumatizing than the original trauma, more traumatizing than even depression or the fear of not being able to get over depression. What's worse is what we do and say because of those experiences, because of how we're feeling. Right? As I said, this author turned down a dinner invitation because of his depression. Right? The traumatized can be horrible to their family members, and they'll feel worse about that than their own suffering. Certainly worse than their original trauma. So we go on. The next paragraph is, depression afflicts millions directly and millions more who are relatives or friends of victims. I made a little note that I argue billions. It's billions of people. It is billions. Again, we're talking about the full spectrum here. He's not just talking about these severe, intractable, right? And then later he says 1 in 10 will suffer from the illness. I say it's more like 6 in 10 at some point will have a certain amount of aridity, as St. John called it, right? They'll have a disconnection from what they used to consider their joy, their passion, their meaning, their value. Then here's that note where he says women are at a considerably higher risk than men. So I just asked the question, are they though? Right? Or is it just more socially acceptable for women to seek this sort of help? Or whatever it might be, it's just something we should look into. He says the occupational list is surprising, right? Sushi chef's cabinet. And I just said, it's not just air traffic controllers, right? Because when I was a kid, that's what people thought. These people that would have mental breakdowns, nervous breakdowns. There were people in these incredibly stressful jobs, but it doesn't have to be, right? Because you can have how many people in that profession who aren't affected by it. If it's just 1% that are, well, then that's not everyone. It's not the job alone. But then there are situations that the reverse is just as true, that people are ignorant to the likelihood of trauma. The example I gave is a therapist who was surprised at all by the fact that he was traumatized from counseling convicted sex offenders, right? So not just run-of-the-mill predators, but ones that have been caught and convicted. So the worst of the worst. And yet, with all of his training in psychology and medicine or whatever it was he was getting, never once did he stop and go, well, geez, yeah, that's going to mess me up if I'm a normal person. Never mind how weird it is that that's what you want to get into. I really don't get it. Right? I don't, but we won't go there. He proceeds to go on and talk about few people escape from being a potential victim of the disease. That's why I'm surprised he said 1 in 10. Didn't mention that he thinks, as I do, it might be many, many more. He mentions artist types being more common, afflicted to this. I don't know. I think it's just more commonly understood. Artists are naturally a little bit different. I mean, I made a note of Nietzsche and Jung here because it kind of flies in the face of Nietzsche and Jung, both of whom are psychologists that I respect, philosophers that I respect, both of which think that the solution to these issues, to our malaise, is creation, is value, is meaning. Right? As Nietzsche said, man, we are the valuator, the evaluator. So it seems odd, right? Odd that we would consider the artists most susceptible. I argue it's the neurodiversional. It's the people predisposed to these sorts of experiences that are more commonly attracted to these artistic pursuits. Like, look at me. I'm trying to reinvent myself, a renaissance, right? Which means a rebirth in French. It's just a beautiful word if you think about it. Because I can't do what I used to do. I mean, as I said, I just came off of not being able to walk for months because I hurt my foot. Never mind, some days of the week I can't walk, sit, stand, or lie down because of inflammation, arthritis, and you name it. Not unlike Nietzsche. But like Nietzsche, there's an argument to be made that not only do you have a greater appreciation for the times when you're not suffering, but that's where Nietzsche got a lot of his passion and his vigor, is because there was times that he was laid out. He put in twice the amount of passion on the days that he wasn't. Right? So same as the author here. He mentions a few, many, not a surprise, some surprising to me. Vincent van Gogh, not a surprise. Virginia Woolf, a little bit of a surprise. Romain Gary, that's the one he talked about earlier. I don't know how much. Sylvia Plath. I mean, Jack London was a surprise to me. Right, that he was a suicide. I don't understand that. Ernest Hemingway, not a surprise because I knew he did it, but it is a surprise considering this man's understanding of the human experience, and yet he still... So arguably, I think this man was suffering from a combination of both PTSD and trauma, lack of meaning, and maybe some sort of autoimmune disease. I mean, we can look at Jordan Peterson. I'm watching him. He started to get better when he moved to his carnivore diet. I liken it to, it's like the food elimination. So there's something that was causing his autoimmune disease to just go crazy. Like for me, dairy can do it. That can just, I mean, like if I eat something that's contaminated with some of the stuff that I'm allergic to, that could make me suffer for weeks on end from one little mistake that wasn't listed on the packaging, or I didn't read the packaging, like hot dogs. How many people would think that hot dogs could be contaminated with all sorts of different things, right? Wheat and eggs and soy and all this other stuff. But lately I've been seeing Jordan Peterson, his health is beginning to deteriorate again, most particularly his mood. And I liken it to he began to control his immune disease by controlling his inflammation, because I experienced it myself. I tried doing the vegan thing, but it seems that being short on acetylcholine actually made my inflammatory condition much worse. So we're watching this in real time, right? And then there's a few more that he mentioned. There was even one poet who was critical of another thinker who took his life only to take his own later, right? So he mentioned a caveat for all who are judgmental about self-destruction. I argue, be more curious and less judgmental wholesale, right? So he says, when one thinks of these doomed and splendidly creative men and women, one is drawn to contemplate their childhoods, where, to the best of anyone's knowledge, the seeds of the illness take strong root. Could any of them have had a hint, then, of the psyche's perishability, its exquisite fragility? And why were they destroyed while others, similarly stricken, struggled through? Right? So there you go, struggle through. There's your reference to Camus. When he mentioned contemplate their childhoods, it's not just artists and creatives, that's everybody. That's the childhood trauma. That's what's called the ACE, the Adverse Childhood Experience. What was the E? What would they call it? Is the Adverse Childhood Experience Quotient? Whatever. It's a 1 to 10. It's a short little questionnaire. The higher the number you have, the more likely you will be to have an addiction issue, and maybe even be in jail, depression, anxiety, mood dysregulation, you name it, the higher number you are. So I made a note here, just again, because of everything he said about the mind, the psyche, that's the mind, right? Psyche, being so perishable, fragile, easily destroyed. I argue, no, not so. I think the greatest quality of our psyche and our mind is how plastic, our plasticity, right? So I argue it's both the cause and the cure of our malaise. The plasticity of our brain, of our mind, of ourself, right? It's this plasticity that is the cause of our malaise, right? Because you have an experience that's negative and you don't want to repeat that. So you'll see negative experience everywhere you go. Get in a car accident, for example, which was one of his friends who passed away that he thought it might have been the trauma from a car accident they were in. I think that was, well, it doesn't matter. One famous artist took his life, and they think it might have been because of a car accident he was in and traumatized from that, right? So those trauma-informed adaptations, that's that plasticity of the mind. The mind adapts and overcomes. But if it's not helping us, like I said before, right, take the cannolis and leave the gun. If you take the gun and leave the cannolis, right, if you're carrying something with you that is no longer of benefit, then all you're doing is re-traumatizing and re-harming yourself throughout, right? And then we go to the next page. I just made a note of Swiss-born psychiatrist Adolf Meyer. He mentions finer rhythms of English. He was unaware of the semantic damage he inflicted by offering the word depression. I don't see it as a problem. Depression, you're depressing, it's retardation, it's holding back, suppression, like depression. I mean, depression in the ground in an idea, like, it fits. It's all in his perception that he thinks the word depression is actually a negative. So, because I say words do not cause a disease, perception does. right? Because same as with his belief that depression, oh, that's such a negative term in the word, and that's just in your mind the way you see it. He puts forward, he wants to lobby for something more arresting, a designation more arresting. He posits brainstorm as a possible word because he considers it, quote, a howling tempest in the brain. He says we don't use the phrase nervous breakdown anymore, or it's on its way out, and that might be of benefit, but he says, well, maybe we could find something better for depression as well. And as far as his depression, he goes back to talking about his depression. He said he was about 60 when it first took hold, right? 60 years, a midlife crisis. And he talks about, well, what could it have been from? And he wholly admits that, it's a three-body problem here. It's too complicated, really, to find the direct cause, right? The straw that broke the camel's back, right? And so the next page, the greatest fallacy about suicide lies in the belief that there is a single immediate answer, right? I push towards the tetralemma in all of these things, right? Because if you understand that there may not be an answer to everything, there's an acceptance, there's an understanding, there's a certainty in that overcomes the uncertainty of trauma, right? The certainty in uncertainty. It sounds weird, but it's similar to the duality of non-duality that we talk about in Vedanta or in Buddhism, right? The unity of the opposites of Jung, right? This idea that it's very similar to his individuation process, your integration of the shadow. Our job is to understand that we have within us the good and the bad, but the same can be said, the truth that we may not understand everything, we may not have a cause to all of our effects. And as Jung warned us, that was a negative affect of our archaic selves, that we needed a cause to all of our effects, so we applied a lot of fantasy, narrative theory that was, fiction. The worry here is narrative theory has to be based in something that's beneficial to oneself and the system, others. If it's only beneficial to oneself, it's only going to denature the self. Similar to how the author was talking about that he read just about everything when it comes to medicine, yet he never saw within himself these symptoms of depression or apathy or whatever it might be. Well, good afternoon. We're just going to keep going on here. We're about halfway through, actually, so that's good. And I don't know if it gets... So we'll just skip through a few things here. He talks about Abby Hoffman's death. I mentioned, did he have a trauma from an accident? Also his mother's illness. His buddy Randall Jarrell, declining career, and he had a vicious book review. And his buddy Primo Levi, it was rumored he was burdened by caring for his paralytic mother, which was more onerous to his spirit than even his experience in Auschwitz, right? I would recommend Gabor Mate's books, and he talks about how caring for a family member can be incredibly traumatizing and dehumanizing for both, even, believe it or not. And I love this quote that he has here: bloody and bowed by the outrages of death. Right? He says, but most human beings still stagger on down the road, unscathed by real depression. It's Camus, right? Next page, beyond the manifest crisis. That's what he calls the depression, a manifest crisis. I like that because it is, right? What's your manifest? That's your ethos, your telos. Like manifest for a ship, right? People that are on it, where it's going, what it's bringing, what for, all that jazz. So if you lose your manifest, or even your connection to your meaning. That's what can cause a crisis, a catharsis. Right? So he goes on and talks about this manifest crisis involved alcohol, a substance he'd abused for 40 years. So there you go. I asked early, was he an addict? His trauma. What's his adverse childhood experience score, right? Childhood trauma. There's a lot of questions to be had there. Right? So he said he used alcohol as the magical conduit to fantasy and euphoria, and to the enhancement of the imagination. Boy, Jung would be pretty sad there, right? Because that's the opposite, right? All that's doing is fantasy, euphoria, not imagination, not true imagination. As Carl Jung experimented in active imagination, it's important to be as lucid as possible. You do leave reason behind, so you can interact with sense and nonsense, but it's not strictly fantasy, and you certainly want to be in your right state, right? So this is why we're pretty careful about some of this stuff that we play with, right? So he says, there's no need to either rue or apologize for my use of this soothing, often sublime agent, which had contributed greatly to my writing, yada, yada, yada. I found it really weird that he would talk of alcohol that way, soothing and sublime. That's really cringy to me, alcohol. I'm more like Sherlock Holmes. I think alcohol makes you dumb, right? And he goes on and talks about, in conjunction with music, that meant a lot, let his mind conceive visions that the unaltered sober brain had no access to. Right? There's your active imagination. But the way he did it is he'd prime his imagination with the booze, and then he'd go and experiment for his writing sober, supposedly. I don't know how true that would be. It seems a little odd that you'd get drunk to get some ideas and then wait till you were sober to write those ideas out. But I get it. He had a notebook. He didn't go into great detail about what was in it or what it was for. Then I highlight here, I now see as a means to calm the anxiety and incipient dread that I had hidden away for so long somewhere in the dungeons of my spirit. Well, there's the truth, right? He's writing this book, try to teach people the dangers of not just depression, but ignoring your depression. And yet he talks about how booze was so awesome, and yet at the end of that page he admits that it was causing this dungeon of his spirit, because later he also blames benzodiazepine for having exacerbated his condition. So why wouldn't the alcohol have been part of this problem? Oh yes, it's a depressive, but it didn't do it to me. Okay, there's a lot of cope, a lot of addicts say that, and it's understandable because he later talks about how much he disliked group therapy. So once again, like some of these other doctors, some of these other patients, I think he never bought in fully to the process here, because group therapy is not simply about the group therapy. Group therapy is about self-inquiry, narrative theory, understanding yourself. And the only way we can do that, we've talked about, is via community. So if you're an addict or depressive or whatever it is, you need another context. You need a community, a sangha of like-minded individuals who are attempting to navigate through these malaise marshes, or I don't know, just being silly. But he talked about how he didn't see the benefit of group therapy, and I'm starting to see where he kind of made his mistake then, is that the group therapy was meant to teach him how to understand himself, that the alcohol was only euphoric because it helped relieve him of some of this angst. All right, but I digress. All right, so on we go. And then he said not too long after that he could no longer drink. I find that funny. He said it really made him sick. It was like it had turned into an ant-abuse. That's a little weird. We didn't go into that in great detail. But then he said he began to experience a vaguely troubling malaise, right? Uncertainty. Right? This vaguely troubling malaise. That's exactly what Carl Jung talked about 100 years ago. He said 20% of his patients suffered from this unattributable caused malaise, right? So here's where his real trouble began. And so he said, the shadows of nightfall seemed more sober. My mornings were less buoyant. Walks in the woods became less zestful. And there was moments during my working hours in the late afternoon when a kind of panic and anxiety overtook me. And, he said he was in the grips of the beginning of a mood disorder. When I reflected on this curious alteration of my consciousness, this is when the aridity comes on, and it tends to come on slowly until its grip is undeniable. St. John of the Cross, Nietzsche, Jung, William James, they've all written these stories. Camus, an idea of when you're disconnected from your joy, from your passion, from your meaning, that comes on slowly, right? You care a little bit less every day, and you'll lose your connection to blessings, to understanding. But I'll go on. It had never truly depressed me during my drinking career, acting instead as a shield against anxiety. That's what I was talking about, how the alcoholism made it depressive, but he tries to say, it never made me depressed, it acted as a shield against anxiety. Well, I hate to say, this is a truth of the traumatized, that particularly childhood trauma. You become used to this sense of dread. So drinking, it's kind of like people with ADHD taking a stimulant. Drinking doesn't make you depressed because being depressed is the state at which you're most comfortable and familiar with. So it doesn't make you depressed the way other people feel or understand it. It makes you more your perceived self, right? You consider yourself this way. Right? So he says, for a long time, had to kept my demons at bay. Yeah. I made a note, this felt sense of a lost power or control. Right? That's what he's really seeing. Made a mention of depression's black tempest. He loves using those big words. Goes on and talks about Martha's Vineyard, right? Ooh, lots of money, this man. That's why he survived, in no small part because of the access to the hospitals, the doctors, the money he had, right? Like, it's really quite surprising. But it goes in Congress with the truth that some of our most unhappiest people in the world are our richest people, right? So he said, I felt a kind of numbness, an enervation, but more particularly an odd fragility, as if my body had actually become frail, hypersensitive, and somehow disjointed and clumsy, lacking normal coordination. And soon I was in the throes of a pervasive hypochondria. The reason why he mentions that, he says that he feels hypochondria and this malaise, I can't remember the word they used early on here, before depression. What was the word they used? Well, doesn't matter. He's just mentioning that, hypochondria and this malaise that we suffer from, they tend to be related. I made a note about somatic response to stress, right? Because we know this. Somatic response to stress is what he's explaining here, how the brain tends to shut down. You get a tunnel vision, all this disjointed, clumsiness, lack of coordination, right? All of this related to trauma. And then his mention of this pervasive hypochondria. I equate that more to catastrophizing. I actually said catastrophizing more so. So I wouldn't call it hypochondria. I would call it, like he said in the morning he felt okay, but it would get worse progressively throughout the day because it would get worse throughout the day, but also because he would continue worrying about this coming on throughout the day, right? Self-fulfilling prophecy, as it were. He goes on and talks about the perceptions of Don Dryden and others. A connection is made between melancholia and hypochondria. There's the word I was talking about. Hypochondria and melancholia. Sadness, as it was back in the day. Used by writers like Sir Walter Scott and the Bronte sisters. A melancholy to a preoccupation with bodily ills. He mentions how, this is an apparatus of defense for the psyche. It is, even trauma, right? There's different reactions to trauma: fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and it's changed a little bit. They've added more to the freeze and fawn, well, to the fawn particularly. This please and appease, and so we tend to try to work within whatever we're given. And if you are in a weird situation, a traumatic or a dangerous situation that you can't get out of, that's what develops some of these most extreme experiences. And so, as we've read from this author, he saw himself as being a victim of this depression. Like it's a daemon that hangs over him and torments him, this evil specter, right? This mare, this dark mare oppressing him. So, of course, it's a self-fulfilling experience, right? All right, so we're continuing on here. So he says, the mind announces to its indwelling consciousness that it is the body, with its perhaps correctable defects, not the precious and irreplaceable mind that is going haywire. Right? So the note here is what he was talking about is we try to convince ourselves that it's not our mind that's losing its grip, it's the body. But that's what's funny. Like, fast forward the 30 years since he wrote this book, we now realize that this malaise, this depression, this melancholia can cause physical, it's not hypochondria, it can cause physical issues, I guess you could say. So I said, not mind, but body fails. So I just highlight Gestalt, right? That's the truth that we've come to learn about this, is that there is no healing for the mind without a healing for the body, and vice versa. So next highlight is the doctor pronounced me totally fit. So what he did is he went and had a battery of tests. But the truth is, there is no test for depression, right? And again, we're seeing his money, same as the next paragraph. By now I'd moved back to my house in Connecticut. I've lost track of how many houses he has, but it's a lot of money. So that's a farmhouse. I don't know if that's Martha Vineyard, the same place. It's been his beloved home for 30 years, right? He says his spirits regularly sank to their nadir. I love that word. I've mentioned it before. That the 10 compass points, we've lost 2 of them. We know of 8, but we forget the 2 most important. The inner compass points of the zenith and the nadir. The zenith is the best we can be, the ultimate. The nadir is the worst, the lowest. And until we understand this, that we have within us the ability to achieve both our nadir and our zenith, right? That's what we're endowed with. Not a perfect understanding, but an ability to judge between our nadir and our zenith, right? What is better than our previous self, not better than any other, right? So we call this Slant of Light of Emily Dickinson. Slant of light, right? Made notes of, I wondered how this friendly place teeming with such memories, talking about his farmhouse, the beauty of the farmhouse, right? This slant of light, your perception, how this erosion into darkness from light, right? So he talks about lads and girls, the laughter, singing. He was never alone, but he felt so alone. He said he felt an immense and aching solitude. Right? This, he goes on in this paragraph, and he's 100% explaining his aridity, right? He's explaining his previous joys and how he had been distanced from them. And not having what I call a movable safety, or not having context. He goes on to talk about how he lost his stuff out on a walk because of Canada geese. Proceeds to go on and talk about Baudelaire, where quote is, "I have felt the wind of the wing of madness." Right? So, I mean, Jung felt he'd lost his mind twice, at least. I mean, Goethe wrote Faust, trying to understand this. I have no doubt that Proust wrote In Search of Lost Time, again, to try to understand. And so we have, it's time to banish the harsh, old-fashioned words of madhouse, asylum, insanity, melancholia, lunatic, madness. But never let it be doubted that the depression in its extreme form is madness. He says he wants to banish madness, but he says it is madness. As I said in the beginning, it depends on your definition of madness. Right? He says the madness results from an aberrant biochemical process. If he just means it's an aberrant experience, yeah, I would agree. But I ask, is it madness, or is that hopelessness? Right? The sick soul. The sick soul is not mad. He's pragmatic. He understands that life is inherently suffering. That can't be denied.